Excellent. Okay, so thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about some of this work. So the title of the talk is Diversity is All You Need, Learning Skills Without a Reward Function. And this is joint work with a number of collaborators, including Xing Gu, Abhishek Gupta, Juliet Irbaz, and Sergey Levin. And if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to stop me and ask questions. The point of this is not so I can talk, but so that you can learn cool things. Okay, so to start, before talking about what we actually do in this paper, I want to talk about some of the challenges that face reinforcement learning today. And a lot of these challenges revolve around human supervision. That is, when we want to deploy reinforcement learning algorithms, what often stops us is not technical problems, but problems that have to do with relying on humans. And we do this in a number of ways. For example, we rely on humans to design reward functions. We somehow expect that humans will be able to say, okay, this is what I want the robot to do. And to do that, here's some really complicated mathematical expression of corresponding to these are good states and these are bad states. And in practice, this is really hard to define. A second challenge is designing skills, especially when we want robots or other autonomous agents to solve temporally extended tasks. It's often useful to be able to break down those tasks into a series of simpler tasks. But automatically learning these tasks is often quite challenging, and that'll actually be the main focus of today's talk. A third challenge is tuning hyperparameters. Despite reinforcement learning algorithms being much more stable today than they were, say, 5 years ago, they still depend heavily on a number of really critical hyperparameters. And tuning those parameters often relies on just human ingenuity, which is sort of annoying. Resetting. This is an issue that often gets overlooked. When we have something like a robot deployed in the real world, we often segment its training into a sequence of episodes. And at the end of every episode, we assume that the robot is magically reset back to some initial state. And for things like video games, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. You can just reset all of the bits in the game back to some initial state. But for things like robots or self-driving cars or chemical plants, resetting the state is often quite challenging. You often have to have some human operator come in and rearrange everything. I'm not going to talk about this in this talk, but it's one important challenge that I want to see more work on in the future. And the last two challenges are safety. We don't want robots to break themselves, and curriculum learning. For really complicated tasks, it's often nearly impossible to solve them in a single shot. And so insofar as we can break down those tasks into a sequence of easier tasks, then it might be easier to solve them. And so today's talk, as I alluded to before, is going to focus mostly on learning useful skills. Before we actually dive into what skills are, one of the reasons that skills will be useful is that they'll actually help us solve a number of these other problems. They'll help us make progress on things like designing reward functions, hyperparameter tuning, and curriculum learning. Okay, so what do I mean by a skill? So a skill fundamentally is some behavior that some autonomous agent can do. And ultimately, what defines a skill depends on the environment you're in. So if we look at this quadruped robot right here, skills might correspond to walking forwards or walking backwards, crouching down or jumping up. But for a different robot, you might get different sorts of skills. For example, for this arm robot, skills may correspond to throwing or stacking or sorting objects. And in both of these examples, it's pretty clear what different skills would be. You and I can sit down and write down what a set of reasonable skills would be. Now, one of the interesting things about learning skills is that they might also help us understand what are the capabilities of a robot like this, of a robot that it's really hard a priori to know what is it possible for this robot to do. Can this robot roll forward and roll backwards? Can this robot jump? Can this robot flatten itself like a pancake? If we can learn a set of skills that spans the behavior of the robot, we might be able to figure out and then better understand what robots can do. Okay, so at this point we've introduced skills. I want to talk a little bit about what are good skills, what makes one skill or some skills better than other skills. And there are a couple things that might make skills useful. One is we might want skills that do good exploration. That is, we might want different behaviors that go to different parts of the state space. Another thing we might want is predictability. That is, if you say, I'm executing skill 1, we should always be able to know what will skill 1 do? What will be the outcome of executing skill 1? And this is especially important if we want to compose skills hierarchically. That is, if we want to string together some sequence of skills, first executing skill 1 and then executing skill 2. Because if the meaning of skills change, if the outcome of executing skills change, then it's really hard to know what will happen when I execute skill 1 and then skill 2. And then a third property that might be useful is interpretability. That is, if you see the robot doing something, if you see that the robot's in some state, taking some actions, you could be able to infer, okay, oh, that robot's in that state, so it must be executing skill 7, for example. And what all of these properties hint at is that what makes a skill good or bad can't be determined in isolation. Rather, what makes a skill good or bad depends on its relationship to other skills. And so one of the key ideas of this talk is that instead of learning skills in isolation, rather, we're going to focus on learning an entire set of skills. And the objective we're going to use for learning this set of skills is that the set jointly should be as diverse as possible. Okay, so this is sort of the setup of what we want out of a skill learning algorithm. And I'm next going to present the method we use for learning this set of skills. And before presenting it mathematically, I'm going to present it as a game that you or I could actually play if this were in person. So this game works as follows. We have two players standing on either side of, say, a big football field. And the goal of the game is for the blue player to communicate some message to the red player. And the players can't talk to each other. They're too far away. And so the only way that the blue player can communicate to the red player is by doing things. By, say, standing upright with his hands on its side. Or maybe it can communicate a different message by leaning over to one side. Or it could communicate a third message by jumping and kicking, or by holding its leg, or by doing other motions. And one of the ideas here is that the blue player, in trying to convey information to the red player on the opposite side of the football field, the blue player has to figure out different motions they can do, different motions that are distinguishable from one another. Because if the red player can't distinguish one motion from another motion, they won't be able to tell what message the blue player is trying to play. This game here lies at the core of the algorithm that we proposed. I'll explain how that works now. So to do that, we need a little bit of mathematical machinery. And so we can formally quantify the amount of information that the blue player conveys to the red player as follows. So let's say that the blue player is communicating 3 messages, either A, B, or C. And they're going to do that using 3 actions: leaning over, jumping and kicking, or swaying to one side. We can precisely say that the amount of information that the blue player is sending to the red player is at least as great as how well the red player can predict what the blue player is doing. So get some intuition for this. If the red player can always accurately infer that kicking means code word B, then this probability is going to be quite large. And so that means that the blue player is successfully communicating many bits to the red player. If in contrast, the red player is never able to predict what message the blue player is trying to send, then this term is going to be quite low. And what this bound here highlights is that if we want to maximize information, we actually have to care about the performance of both the players. We both want the blue player to execute distinguishable behavior, but we also want the red player to be able to accurately guess what the blue player is trying to do. So before we instantiate this inside a reinforcement learning algorithm, I want to pause here to see if there are any questions.
Well, I'm kind of interested still in how you, a step earlier, how did you get into that perspective that the diversity of skills and like these three requirements are really what matters about skills, and they're like a little bit of a step before that, like how did you end up with these three requirements,
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of this just came from looking at intuitively what we think useful skills would be. And ultimately, we care about learning skills not for the purpose of learning skills, but we care about learning skills because they will help us solve downstream tasks. And so one way we could use skills for solving downstream tasks is to compose them hierarchically. That is, instead of planning at the level of, say, motor torques or joint angles, we can plan at the level of more abstract behaviors. And this requirement that we'd be able to use skills for hierarchical RL was one of the motivations for making skills predictable. The motivation for exploration is sort of similar. That is, if we want to be able to use skills to accelerate learning downstream tasks, it would be useful if, when given a reward function in some environment, we're able to very quickly explore this environment. And that motivates us to have skills explore. And one thing that actually makes exploration easier in this setting is that we don't need to have a single skill that does good exploration everywhere. All we need is that for the different skills explore different areas, and that if there's a certain state you want to get to, there's some skill that will get you to that state. And so it was this sort of reasoning about how are we eventually going to use skills that suggested these properties.
Yeah, thank you. Makes sense.
Excellent. Any other questions? If not, maybe we'll move on. Okay, so we have this game, this two-player game, and to turn this into a reinforcement learning algorithm, we're going to basically assign neural networks to the blue player and the red player. And I'll explain how that works. So the blue player is what we're going to call the skill, or the policy. And this player takes as input the current state of the world and some Z. Z corresponds to the code word A, B, or C, or some other object that we discussed before. And the skill outputs a sequence of actions. The other player, the red player, is the discriminator. And the discriminator looks at the state of the world and tries to guess what code word is the skill trying to send. And both the skill and the discriminator are learned. These are learned neural networks. And the whole algorithm works as follows. At the start of every episode, we sample some code word, some Z, from a prior distribution. And we send that to the skill. The skill then interacts with the environment, collecting a whole bunch of experience. Now, at every time step, the discriminator, the red player, looks at the state of the world and tries to guess, okay, what code word, what Z, is the blue player trying to tell me? Are they trying to send A, or are they trying to send B, or are they trying to send C? And then the most important step is how we update the skill. So what we do is we say, if the discriminator was able to successfully guess what code word the skill was trying to send, then we should give the skill some high reward. If the discriminator failed to guess what code word the blue player was trying to send, then the skill shouldn't get very much reward. And mathematically, this exactly corresponds to saying that the reward for the skill corresponds to the log probability that the red player was able to guess the correct code word. And the discriminator here is just updated using standard maximum likelihood. So we tell the discriminator afterwards, okay, so the blue player was actually trying to send code word 4. Update your model to get better at predicting that when they do that behavior, you should predict code word 4. And we call this algorithm diversity is all you need, or DIAN for short. One of the neat things about DIAN is that we show that that this two-player game here corresponds to maximizing the amount of information sent from the blue player to the red player. Exactly corresponds to trying to do well on that game where we had two players on either side of the football field. Let's look at some of the behaviors learned by Diane. So I'll start with a very simple task and then move to more complex tasks. On this very simple task, we have an agent that starts at the center of a room, and it can navigate in any direction. And here we're plotting 6 different skills. And we see that different skills correspond to going to different states in the environment. We see that, say, this pink skill goes to the left, and this light green skill goes to the right. And looking at this plot, we see that this algorithm seems to achieve the 3 properties that we mentioned before. It does good exploration. It goes to most of the states in the environment. It's predictable. That is, if I say, where will the pink skill go? You can tell me, oh, the pink skill, that skill goes to the left. And finally, it's interpretable. Interpretable in the sense that if I say, the agent is at this state right here, what skill did you use to get there? I can say, oh, that was this off-color shade of green that got us there. One other important property of Diane that I want to highlight is that Diane maximizes not just the diversity at the current time step, but rather diversity in the future. And to illustrate that, I want to consider this environment. In this environment, we have the agent start in a hallway. And the hallway is really narrow. And so when the agent is in the hallway, there's nothing it can do to differentiate itself from others. There's nothing the agent can do to differentiate one skill from another skill. And so for skills to become discriminable from one another, they must get to the end of the hallway and out into this open room. And once out in the open room, different skills can take different actions to become discriminable from one another. For example, the yellow skill can go down and the purple skill can go to the right. And this is important because it shows that you can continue to learn skills even in settings where you can't be discriminable soon. To become discriminable in the future, agents must take actions to get to spaces where it's possible to be discriminable from one another. Okay, so now that we've built up some of the intuition for what these skills look like, I want to show some results on some higher dimensional tasks. So here we're looking at a sort of dog-like robot, and we're visualizing some of the skills that were learned. And we see that we've learned skills corresponding to running forwards, running backwards, and even doing front flips. In fact, we've learned more than that. We've learned different ways of running forward. We've learned ways of running forward quickly and ways of running forward slowly. Ways of running forward that involve sort of lying on your nose and scooching forward. We've likewise learned different ways of running backwards. And even different types of front flips. And one of the things I want to emphasize here is that all of these different behaviors have emerged just out of playing that game that we mentioned before. These have all emerged out of playing the game where the robot's trying to communicate some message to the discriminator, to some outside user that's trying to guess what message is the robot trying to send. This also works on other sorts of tasks. So we applied to this quadruped robot, and here the skills are slightly less interpretable, but you still learn skills corresponding to moving in different directions. For a hopping robot, you learn skills corresponding to going forward and backwards. And you even learn different ways of solving Kurt Pole, the famous control task. Any questions about the skills that we've seen so far? After this, I'm going to talk about some of the applications of learning these skills.
Yeah, so one, I can just want to confirm. So do these agents get no reward for getting high rewards from the environment, only intrinsic diversity rewards?
Exactly, yes. I should have emphasized that more. So all of these skills are learned without any reward function. So these skills are learned just by saying, be as diverse as possible. We don't include any term that says, be as diverse and also try to maximize this reward function. No, we don't do that.
That is very impressive. There's also a question in the chat, which I think is the same question that I also wanted to ask. I will, let's do this. Brandon, I will ask the question and you please then confirm if it's the same thing that you wanted to know. Is this discriminator looking at trying to discriminate which skills is being used continuously, or is it looking at the entire trajectory at the end of the episode?
That's a really good question. So the way we do it is that we look at just individual states. We say, given the state, what is the robot trying to do? You can formulate similar objectives that look at entire trajectories, or look at states and actions, look at the state in the initial state, look at the state in the final state, just look at the final state. And there's actually been a lot of work that looks at different aspects of these. There's a good paper by Joshua Acom called Variational Option Discovery Algorithms that talks a little bit about comparisons between these different sorts of objectives. But fundamentally, they all correspond to playing the same game. They're sort of different instantiations of that game.
Interesting. Thanks. There's another question in the chat. Do you see them?
No.
So it says, once the skills are learned, how are they selected from a hierarchical standpoint?
Excellent. Garrett, is it okay if I hold off on that question for a couple slides? I think in like 3 slides, I'm going to have a description of that. Excellent. And I see that there was a question about using hindsight experience replay.
No, that's, well, you can answer
that was earlier.
Yeah, that's something that we were talking about before, but
Excellent.
Feel free to comment on that as well.
There actually is a way to use something similar to hindsight experience replay for this. If people are interested, I can talk more about it at the end of the talk. Okay, so let's talk about some of the applications. So fundamentally, what Diane learns is it learns this range of behaviors that a certain policy can do in a certain environment. And it sort of gives us a low-dimensional knob. And by tuning this knob, we can sweep over the range of behaviors. And note that while the range of behaviors, things a robot can do in an environment, might be somewhat limited, it's a much smaller space than the set of parameters. And so effectively, we've sort of done something like PCA, or dimensionality reduction, on the space of behaviors. And now we have this compact space of behaviors, and just by tuning this low-dimensional knob, see, we can sweep over different behaviors. And I'll show how this is useful for 4 applications: for hierarchical reinforcement learning, as Garrett mentioned, as imitation learning, as parameter initialization, and then for a kind of cool application relating to meta learning. So I'll start with the hierarchical RL application. So we use Diane for hierarchical RL as follows. To start, we place the agent in some environment, and we learn a set of skills. For example, in the top left, we place the cheetah robot on this track with these obstacles, and we just have it learn a set of skills without any reward function. Then, after learning a set of skills, we do hierarchical reinforcement learning as follows. We say that we'll have some high-level policy that chooses skills to execute. Instead of choosing actions, they choose skills. And each skill will be executed for 50 time steps. And then we optimize this high-level policy, in this case, just using policy gradient, using a version of policy gradient called TRPO. And we find that by controlling the agent at the level of skills, which is the red curve, you're able to learn much faster than if you directly control the agent at the level of motor torques, which is the green line here, or if you use other algorithms that directly control the motor's joint angles rather than controlling the behaviors. And that's what's shown in the top right plot. The bottom left plot shows a very similar experiment, where we first put this ant-like robot in an environment, and we have it learning a set of skills without any reward function. Then, when a reward function is given, we learn a high-level policy that chooses which of these skills to execute, and each skill is executed for many time steps. And again, we find that using the skills, commanding the robot at the level of skills, is able to learn much faster. We see the purple curve is much higher than the other curves here. Garrett, does that answer the question about how skills are used hierarchically? Excellent. So another application is, or one thing I want to highlight here is that for the purpose of hierarchical RL, learning more skills is useful. This would make sense. If you only learn 2 skills, it's really hard to solve complex tasks. But if you learn 100 skills, it becomes much easier. And this plot here is just showing that if you learn more skills, then you do much better at solving these hierarchical tasks. There's a question. So for the higher level policy, action space is basically the set of skills. Precisely. And so in our experiments, we learned a discrete set of skills. I think we used 20 or 50. And so the action space is discrete in its size 20 or size 50, depending on how many skills you learned. And we do execute each skill for multiple time steps. I believe it was 50 in the paper.
And so is it the same? So you execute a skill for 50 time steps, and then the discriminators looks at the 50 time steps at the same number, right?
So there's sort of 2 stages that we of the method. So during training, we train for 1,000 time steps, which is the length of these episodes in these environments. And the discriminator looks at every time step individually. Mm-hmm. And then when we deploy, or when we use the skills for hierarchical reinforcement learning, we actually don't use the discriminator at all. All we do is we just execute the learned skills.
Got it. See you sometime later, Thais. Join our next seminars.
So, well, for hierarchical RL, we didn't need to use the discriminator to solve the downstream application. For imitation learning, we will actually use the discriminator. So one other sort of neat application of Diane is for zero-shot imitation learning. And by zero-shot imitation learning, I mean the following thing. We show the agent some behavior. Like we show the agent, okay, here's a robot performing some task. And then we immediately want our agent to replicate that behavior. We want our robot to do the exact same thing without any additional training. And here's how we can do that. And it's actually a very small modification to the algorithm we used for learning the set of skills. So whereas before, we took a skill, fed it into the environment, and then had the discriminator guess what code word is the skill trying to send. What we do now is we take the expert and we say, given the expert states, what skill is the expert trying to send? And of course, the expert has no idea what these skills are, but we can still ask the discriminator, if this were one of the skills, which skill would this be? And so the discriminator tells us which of our skills is most similar to the expert. And then by executing the corresponding skill, we can get a good approximation to the expert's behavior. So I'll show some examples of that. So this top row, so in this top left example, we have an expert that's lying on his back. And then we feed this state into the discriminator, and the discriminator says, oh, that must be skill 7 or something like that. And then we execute the corresponding Diane skill. And we see that this skill is a pretty good approximation to the expert's behavior. Similarly, if the expert rolls on its nose, then we see that the retrieved Diane skill also rolls on its nose. And of course, it doesn't always work. And so in the far right, we show an example of a failure case where the expert is on its nose and the Diane skill also rolls onto its nose, but doesn't quite do the full handstand. And that sort of makes sense because if you haven't learned how to learned a skill for a certain behavior, that it's going to be really hard to imitate that behavior. Okay. Any questions about either the hierarchical RL or the imitation learning applications?
I mean, the approach is pretty clear, but the applications, you haven't talked about them too much, but I can think of so many directions. So have you looked into it further? Like, what can you apply it to, actually?
Like what are you thinking of?
Multi-agent, various multi-agent games where, for example, judging what the other player does is important, like you're playing Pong with two players, for example, or something.
That'd be really cool. There's been some work on, so here we're maximizing information between the, basically between the two players in this game. Interestingly, there's been some work on multi-agent RL that minimizes information between players, where they try to say that you want to have agents solve a task independently, and so you want them to specialize. But I very much agree it would be cool to see this in a multi-agent setting, and maybe you could show that you get interesting robustness benefits because different agents end up solving a task in different ways. I don't know.
Yeah, basically, like tons of directions for further work for all of you guys to pick up potentially.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone has ideas they want to chat more about, you should bring them up now or at the end, or shoot me an email.
Sure.
Of a policy for a downstream task. So let's say you want to solve a task in some environment, and normally you would say run reinforcement learning. And you would initialize your parameters, say, by sampling from a normal distribution. We can do something slightly smarter, which is that instead of initializing the policy using random weights, we can initialize the policy weights using one of the skills learned by Diane. And the intuition here is that the skills learned by Diane reflect the set of behaviors that are possible in this environment. And so it sort of reflects a bias about what sorts of behaviors will be useful in this environment. And we show that by initializing a policy using one of the skills learned by Diane, you're able to learn much faster than if you just randomly initialize your policy. And so I think this is sort of interesting because it suggests that even in settings where you wouldn't really think of skill learning being useful, just the standard, so this here is the standard RL setting. There's no multi-agent, there's no hierarchical RL, we don't have multiple agents, and these aren't hard exploration tasks. Even in this setting, learning skills is useful because it gives us good parameter initializations for solving these sorts of tasks. And the final application is kind of weird, but also sort of interesting in thinking about what are the range of things you can learn without a reward function. And this is to meta-reinforcement learning. So I'll first explain how meta-reinforcement learning, back a little bit. Great, okay. So what is meta-reinforcement learning? Meta-reinforcement learning is the problem of learning a learning algorithm that's good at solving tasks. So this usually works as follows. You put an agent in an environment with an unknown reward function, and then the robot has to quickly figure out what is the reward function and maximize that reward function. And usually, reward functions might correspond to navigating to different locations or maybe running at different velocities. And ordinarily,
can you specify a little bit what do you mean by unknown reward function? Because in one sense of the word, it's always unknown, right? We only get samples from the function. In another sense of the world, how do we even if we don't even get examples of rewards, how is it possible to optimize it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. By unknown here, I mean that the agent does get samples of the reward, but every time the agent interacts with the environment, so for every episode, they're solving a different task. And so the reward function changes. So one day the robot's solving one task, the next day the robot's trying to go to a different location, and the third day the robot's trying to go to a third location. And so what this means is that in the course of every episode, the robot has to say, okay, I've gotten a little bit of reward so far today, so maybe the goal is hidden over here. I should try to run over there. And so meta-reinforcement learning works, but it has one main limitation, which is that you have to design a set of reward functions to use for training. So the hope of meta-reinforcement learning is that you learn how to quickly learn unknown tasks, and then you can put a robot in a new environment and it will be able to solve any task you want. But this ability hinges critically on the design of the reward functions used for training. So during training, you may have placed the goal in 3 different locations, or you may have given the robot rewards corresponding to going forwards one day and going backwards a different day. But you had to sit down and manually define those reward functions. And manually defining them is actually really hard. I'll give one sort of funny example of this. So one of the tasks people do in meta-reinforcement learning is ant navigation, where you have an ant-like robot navigate to a set of goals. And you might think, well, let's sample goals on a circle that's around the robot. But it turns out that that task is too challenging. And so you have to carefully tune the difficulty of the task. And so most meta-reinforcement learning tasks only consider goals sampled from a semicircle because the full circle is too challenging. And to bring this up to highlight that to get meta-reinforcement learning algorithms to work well, you have to very carefully consider how are you going to define reward functions? How are you going to make sure that the reward functions are not too easy and not too hard and induce a sufficiently diverse set of behaviors? Now, Diane allows us to lift one of these limitations. Diane allows us to automatically propose the set of reward functions we use for meta-reinforcement learning. So this works as follows. So first, we assume we're given some environment, and then we do what we call unsupervised meta-learning. And what I mean by this is that instead of so normally in meta-reinforcement learning, you have some agent try to solve new reward functions in every episode. And these reward functions are manually specified by some human. What we do now is something slightly different. We say, we're going to maximize reward functions that are specified by skills. So we have one reward function corresponding to code word 1. And specifically, the reward function we use is the discriminator's predictions. So one task is make the discriminator think that you're conveying code word 1. And a different task is make the discriminator think that you're conveying code word 2. And so on and so forth. And so the interesting thing here is that these tasks that we've learned, or these tasks that we're using for meta-reinforcement learning, are not manually specified. And so we no longer have to have a human come in and write down what are the set of behaviors that we want to train on. We can learn this unsupervised without any human in the loop. And the motivation for doing this unsupervised meta-learning, is that at test time, when a human actually comes along and says, maximize this reward function as quickly as possible, we can do that. And we can do that because we've learned how to solve a wide range of tasks. We've learned how to solve a very diverse set of tasks in this environment. I know this is a little bit convoluted. Are there any questions about this unsupervised meta-learning?
I mean, I have a version in my head of how it works. I want you to verify if it's true or not.
Excellent.
So you pick one of the skills. So you acquire this set of skills. Then you pick one of them, and then you reward following that skill. Is that what happens?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And
Right.
importantly, we're doing this in the meta-learning setting. And so we're learning a policy that can quickly adapt to learn these different skills. So the robot should be able to very quickly adapt its behavior to do skill 1 or do skill 2 or do skill 3. And this fast adaptation is important because when we're trying to solve a new task, we don't want to have to keep trying and failing to solve that task. We want to very rapidly be able to figure out which of the behaviors that we've learned before can solve this new task. Okay, so this highlights 4 applications of Diane. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show the results from that. So here's an example of some results on the have-queued task. And there are I guess there's 2 things I want you to look at in this plot. The green line is our method. So when you meta learn using the skills learned from Diane, you're able to learn quite quickly. And the x-axis here is number of trials it takes to learn the task. And we see that we're able to learn these tasks in less than, say, 20 trials. The black line here, is that what we want? Yeah, I think maybe a good comparison is the black line in the right plot. And what that's showing is if you had a human come in and design the set of tasks, that's how quickly you would learn. And we observe that given these oracle human tasks, you would learn initially a little bit faster, but actually asymptotically, you would get lower reward. And what this highlights is that not only does skill learning provide a good set of skills, it actually provides the right set of skills. It provides the right set of skills for learning unknown tasks. Okay, so in this talk, we talked about how we can learn sets of skills without reward functions. And one of the main ideas is that we should optimize over the entire set. And this set should be optimized to be as diverse as possible. The method for doing that was this sort of 2-player game where you have one player, the policy, try to communicate some message, and another player try to infer what message is the first player trying to send. We then looked at some applications of these learned skills. We looked at applications for hierarchical reinforcement learning, for Zeroshot imitation learning, for parameter initialization, and for unsupervised meta learning. There are a number of new and interesting ways we can take this. A lot of these problems people have looked at certain aspects of them, but there's still lots of interesting open questions. So one is this sort of chicken and the egg problem, where we're jointly optimizing the skills in the discriminator. But if the policy hasn't learned discriminable skills, then the discriminator can't distinguish one skill from another, and then the policy doesn't get any reward. And somehow we sort of have to break this chicken and the egg cycle, where nothing ever gets improved. In practice, some amount of random initialization seems to help with that, but maybe there are more intelligent ways of doing that. Maybe you could start by, say, running an off-the-shelf exploration algorithm, and then segmenting that behavior into a set of skills. A second application is applying this to real-world tasks. As I alluded to in the beginning, when we apply things in the real world, we have to cope with a whole range of additional challenges, things like resetting and things like ensuring safety, and figuring out how do you learn skills that can be learned in a reset-free manner and can be learned in a safe manner, I think is a really interesting research question. A third question is about semi-supervised reinforcement learning. So while many of the tasks we look at are relatively low dimensional, as we move on to higher dimensional tasks, the range of behaviors that you could do can be quite large. And maybe if we can provide just a little bit of additional supervision about what skills we actually care about, we'd be able to solve downstream tasks in these environments much more quickly. For example, maybe you have a robot that has arms and legs, but maybe all that you really care about is walking around. And if all you care about is walking around, you probably can ignore any behaviors that move the arms around. And figuring out how can you efficiently encode this inductive bias that moving around, that walking is important, but arm motions aren't, seems useful for accelerating skill learning. Finally, and I think the thing I'm most excited about is just figuring out how to scale this. So in the environments we tried, we found that using more than about 50 skills didn't improve behavior. We found that it was really hard to learn more than 50 behaviors in these environments. But for more complex tasks, for tasks that involve many objects or multiple robots, say in a multi-agent setting, there have to be a much larger range of possible behaviors. And figuring out how do you efficiently learn huge sets of skills, huge libraries of skills, I think is a really important problem. You could imagine that given an unknown environment, you first learn the library of behaviors, and then any researcher that wants to use this environment in the future no longer has to do reinforcement learning on the original environment, but now can just search over the space of learned skills. This would provide, in the same way that people use pre-trained language embeddings like BERT or pre-trained image embeddings from, say, a ResNet, this would provide us with a similar mechanism to use pre-trained skills for solving downstream tasks. So those are 4 ideas of directions that we could take this. I'd love to open the floor now to hear about some of the ideas that all of you have for taking these sorts of projects. And if any of you want to chat more about this afterwards, feel free to shoot me an email and we can set up a time to chat. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was a very interesting talk. Do you want me to read questions from the chat, or will you?
I figured out how to pull it up. Thanks. I see there's an earlier question from Anton about have you tried it on a football environment? No, but I think that'd be really cool. Maybe you would learn like different strategies. Like I know that different football players have played their position in different ways. So different goalies have different strategies, and different strikers have different strategies. And it's really cool to see that those sort of differences of behaviors could emerge out of an objective like this. A question from Brandon, does the meta RL agent use any information in the skill agent, or does it just use the discriminator from Diane? For meta reinforcement learning, we just use the discriminator. We did not use the policy itself.
Yeah, I wonder if it can be applied in discrimination first settings. So where a main goal is actually not to control agents, but to understand what they're doing. I'm not sure what would be a good example. Maybe you're looking for connections to your server that are trying to break into or something. And then you train with Diane agents and skills, and then you classify skills with discriminator.
Yeah. I've thought about this a little bit in terms of like hacking or fuzzing or making test cases. So many autonomous car companies have entire teams dedicated to constructing hard examples where their agents will fail. Because we know that in many of these real-world applications of autonomous systems, the average cases are actually pretty easy. Driving on a highway or on suburban roads is pretty easy. But there are these edge cases that end up being really hard. And you can imagine using an algorithm like this to automatically discover edge cases. It would work probably as follows. It would be something like, figure out how to change the settings of a scene, figure out what signs to add and how to change the behavior of other cars, such that your own car behaves in different ways. And if you can make your car behave in different wacky ways, then it's possible those are cases that you want to focus more on. For example, if you can set up a scene where your car drives off the road, and you set up another scene where the car drives into oncoming traffic, and you set up a third scene where the car stops in the middle of a lane, then those seem like useful cases to try to debug.
Definitely. Definitely.
I see there's a question from Anton. How much faster is fine-tuning and meta models? So this is in respect. Anton, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is this asking how much faster do you learn by doing fine-tuning instead of doing reinforcement learning from scratch? Was that in this slide here?
I mean, the
Great. Okay. Yeah. So what we observe is that the blue line, which is when you fine tune one of the policies, does learn faster than if you just randomly initialize the policy and learn from there. And how much faster you learn depends a lot on the environment. And so for the Kita task, we observe you learn much, much faster. So we observe it up until this point, the randomly initialized policy hasn't learned anything, but the policy initialized with Diane has already gotten a reward of about 5,000. One of the interesting things is for this ant robot, if you look at the initial starting state, so ant is one of these robots where it's really easy to fall over. And by initializing with one of the skills, you're guaranteed to initialize with a policy that doesn't fall over. And what that means is that this gap of roughly 1,000 rewards just comes from already knowing how to stand up. And knowing how to stand up is a really useful prior for solving downstream tasks. On the hopper task, we observe that these curves are closer together, so there isn't as much benefit from initializing with one of the Diane skills.
I think we should let you go in a couple of minutes, right? But so you have your last chance to ask a question.
I should mention that there has been a huge amount of follow-up work, and so I'd highly recommend checking out some of the papers that have come after this. I personally really liked the unsupervised meta learning project that we worked on, but there's been a lot of other really interesting work on things you can do using these sorts of skill learning methods. What other environments have you run it on, and were there any difficulties? Yeah, so I'll talk about a failure case. So one setting where I really wanted this to work was on a manipulation setting, sort of like the one at the very beginning of this talk. So where I can go to the beginning. So imagine that you have some robot and you can interact with some objects. And ideally, you would learn different skills corresponding to manipulating the objects in different ways. Now, in practice, actually learning those set of skills is really hard. And the reason it's hard is because of exploration. So on a robot like this, what you find when you run something like Diane is that you learn many different ways of moving the arm around, but the arm actually rarely touches the blocks. And because the robot rarely touches the blocks, it becomes hard to solve this chicken and the egg problem. Because if the robot never touches the blocks, the discriminator doesn't learn to associate any configuration of blocks with any certain skill. And because the discriminator doesn't know to identify stacking with one skill and pushing with another skill, then the robot doesn't get rewarded for doing that. And so I really want to see someone figure out how to apply similar skill learning algorithms to a robot like this. I think that would be really, really cool, especially because these exploration problems are not only the problem for skill learning, but they're also the problem for every downstream task that you would try to solve using this robot. And if you would learn a set of skills that correspond to throwing, stacking, pushing, grasping, sorting, etc., then solving downstream tasks becomes almost trivial. And so this is one failure case, but I think it's also one opportunity if you're figuring out how can we extend this. So hopefully that provides some idea of some failure case as well. Are there any other questions right now?
It seems like they're not.
Great.
All right.
Well, as mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, shoot me an email. You can find it on my website. And thanks so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. Let's keep in touch. Maybe we'll join some of our later seminars as well.
Definitely, yeah.
Yes, and thanks everyone for joining.